The young David, a student from humble origins, married a 71-year-old woman in an apparently unconventional marriage. Just 7 days after the union, he is hit with a surprise that leaves him speechless when she reveals something unexpected. David leaned against the cracked wall of his one-room apartment, staring at the ceiling as the dim light of the bare bulb flickered above him. The late afternoon sun filtered through the broken blinds, highlighting the peeling paint on the walls and the sagging mattress on the floor. He could hear the faint hum of the city outside, vendors shouting, children playing in the streets, and the occasional honk of an impatient driver. Inside, it was quieter, but not peaceful. Hunger gnawed at his stomach like a persistent animal, and the weight of a situation pressed down on him with crushing force. At 23 years old, David felt like he was running out of options. His mother, a worn-down woman with calloused hands and a permanent look of worry, had done everything she could to support him and his siblings. But the endless cycle of debt, poorly paid jobs, and unexpected tragedies had left them teetering on the edge of ruin. He had dreams once, dreams of becoming a lawyer, of rising above the poverty that had always shackled him. But dreams felt like a cruel joke now. He worked long hours at a construction site during the day and studied at night, his hands blistered and his eyes red from exhaustion. Yet, despite his efforts, he was falling behind. His tuition fees were overdue, and the college had already sent him 2 warning letters. If he didn't pay soon, he'd be expelled. It was on one of these desperate nights, as he walked home from the construction site, his body aching and his mind spiraling into despair, that he met Margaret. The rain had started without warning, drenching the city in minutes. David ran for cover under the awning of a high-end cafe, his work boots leaving muddy footprints on the clean tiles. That's when he saw her. She was seated at a corner table, her silver hair perfectly styled, and a string of pearls gleaming around her neck. She didn't belong here, he thought. Her elegance stood out against the casual hustle of the cafe. Margaret was the kind of woman you'd expect to see in a magazine, not sitting alone in a cafe on a rainy night. Their eyes met briefly as he wiped the rain from his face, and something about her gaze unsettled him. It wasn't pity, it was curiosity. "Bad night," she called out, her voice warm but commanding. David hesitated before stepping closer. "Bad year," he admitted, offering a weak smile. Margaret gestured to the empty chair across from her. "Sit. You look like you could use a coffee." He wanted to refuse, to keep walking and avoid whatever this was, but the promise of a warm drink and a brief reprieve was too tempting. He sat, feeling awkward under her scrutinizing gaze. "What's your name?" she asked, her tone light but laced with authority. "David," he said. "And you?" "Margaret," she replied, her lips curving into a small smile. "Tell me, David, what's weighing you down?" At first, he hesitated. It wasn't like him to share his burdens with strangers, but something about her demeanor, her calm confidence, her piercing eyes, made him open up. He told her about his struggles, his dreams, and the crushing reality of his financial situation. He spoke of his mother's sacrifices, his siblings' needs, and his own desperation to escape the cycle of poverty. Margaret listened intently, her expression unreadable. When he finished, she leaned back in her chair and studied him for a long moment. "You're ambitious," she said finally. "But ambition without resources is like a car without fuel. It won't get you far." David frowned, unsure whether her words were meant to inspire or belittle him. "I'm doing the best I can," he said defensively. She leaned forward, her eyes locking onto his. "What if I told you I could help? What if I could change your life overnight?" His stomach tightened. Offers like that didn't come without strings attached. "What do you mean?" Margaret's smile widened. "I'll be blunt, David. I'm wealthy, very wealthy. But wealth doesn't buy happiness, and it certainly doesn't buy companionship. I've been alone for a long time, and I'm tired of it." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "Marry me. In exchange, I'll pay off your debts, cover your tuition, and give you a fresh start." David stared at her, stunned. "You want me to marry you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," she said simply. "It's a business arrangement, nothing more. You get the financial stability you need, and I get someone to share my life with. Or at least the appearance of it. His mind raced. The offer was absurd, almost laughable. But the more he thought about it, the more tempting it became. This could be his way out, his chance to finally break free from the chains of poverty. But at what cost? "What's the catch?" he asked warily. Margaret chuckled, a sound that was both amused and enigmatic. "No catch. Just honesty. I know you don't love me, and I don't expect you to, but I do expect loyalty and discretion." David hesitated, his pride warring with his desperation. The thought of marrying someone nearly 3 times his age was daunting, to say the least. But the thought of failing his family, of watching his dreams slip away, was even worse. "Can I think about it?" he asked. Margaret's smile softened. "Of course, but don't take too long. Opportunities like this don't come around often." As he walked home that night, the rain still pouring, David's mind was a storm of conflicting emotions. He thought of his mother, her tired eyes filled with worry. He thought of his siblings, who looked up to him as their beacon of hope. And he thought of himself, trapped in a life that felt like a cage. By the time he reached his apartment, he had made his decision. The next day, he called Margaret. "I'll do it," he said, his voice steady but hollow. And just like that, his life changed forever. The wedding day arrived far sooner than David had anticipated, and with it came a mixture of emotions he couldn't quite name. He stood in front of the full-length mirror in Margaret's mansion, adjusting the collar of his crisp white shirt. The suit he wore was the most expensive piece of clothing he had ever touched, let alone owned. It fit him perfectly, tailored to his lean frame, but the weight of it felt suffocating. The room around him was a stark contrast to the dingy apartment he had called home just days ago. Gold-framed paintings adorned the walls, and the chandelier above glittered like stars caught in crystal. The air smelled faintly of lavender and polished wood, a fragrance so foreign it felt almost out of place on his skin. "You clean up well," came Margaret's voice from the doorway. David turned, his breath catching for a moment. She stood there in an ivory gown, her silver hair swept elegantly into a chignon. Her makeup was subtle but masterful, softening the deep lines on her face. For a fleeting moment, he almost forgot their age gap. She looked regal, like a queen ready to claim her throne. "Thank you," he said, forcing a smile. His voice came out quieter than he intended, almost as if the grandeur of the moment demanded reverence. Margaret's sharp eyes studied him, and for a moment, he felt exposed. "Nervous?" she asked. "A little," he admitted. She stepped closer, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. "Relax," she said, her tone both soothing and commanding. "This is just a formality. After today, your life will be easier. No more struggling, no more sleepless nights worrying about bills. Focus on that." David nodded, but her words didn't ease the knot in his stomach. The ceremony was held in the sprawling garden behind the mansion. Rows of chairs were arranged in perfect symmetry, each seat adorned with a small bouquet of white roses. The late afternoon sun bathed the scene in a golden glow, and the soft strains of a violin quartet filled the air. It was picturesque, the kind of wedding most people dreamed of. And yet, as David stood at the altar, waiting for Margaret to walk down the aisle, he felt an overwhelming sense of disconnection. The guests, friends of Margaret, mostly, were strangers to him, their polite smiles and murmured conversations making him feel like an intruder at his own wedding. When Margaret appeared, escorted by her lawyer, the crowd rose in unison. She moved with an elegance that belied her age, her head held high and her gaze unwavering. As she reached the altar, she took David's hand, her grip firm and steady. The officiant began to speak, but David barely registered the words. His mind was a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. Was this the right choice? Would he regret this for the rest of his life? "Do you, David, take Margaret to be your lawfully wedded wife?" the officiant asked, breaking through his haze. David glanced at Margaret. Her expression was calm, almost expectant. "I do," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. When the ceremony ended, the applause was polite but brief. Margaret didn't seem to notice, or perhaps she didn't care. She led David back into the house, her arm looped casually through his, as if they had been together for years. The reception was small and subdued, with only a handful of guests lingering to sip champagne and offer half-hearted congratulations. Margaret mingled effortlessly, her charm on full display, while David stayed close to her side, feeling like a decorative accessory rather than a partner. As the evening wore on, Margaret leaned in close and whispered, "I'm tired. Let's call it a night." David nodded, relieved to escape the awkwardness of the reception. Together, they climbed the grand staircase to her bedroom, a room that now, technically, was theirs. He started with her study, the one room in the house she had forbidden him from entering. The door was locked, but David remembered seeing a set of spare keys in the kitchen drawer. His heart pounded as he retrieved them, feeling a pang of guilt for what he was about to do. But he told himself it was necessary. He needed answers. The key turned smoothly in the lock, and the door creaked open to reveal a room bathed in golden light from the setting sun. The air inside was stuffy, filled with the faint scent of old paper and ink. Margaret's desk sat in the center of the room, immaculate and imposing, with neatly stacked papers and a leather-bound planner. David hesitated for a moment, his conscience warring with his curiosity. But the memory of Margaret's cryptic behavior pushed him forward. He approached the desk and began sifting through the papers, careful to leave everything as he found it. At first, there was nothing unusual, just financial documents and notes from meetings. But then he found the envelope. It was tucked beneath a stack of folders, marked with his name in bold, elegant handwriting. His heart raced as he opened it, his fingers trembling slightly. Inside was a letter and a set of legal documents. He began with the letter, his eyes scanning the neatly written words. "David, if you're reading this, then I've either been careless or you've decided to break my trust. Either way, I won't hold it against you. You deserve to know the truth." The words blurred before his eyes as his pulse quickened. He read on, each sentence hitting him like a blow. Margaret admitted to orchestrating their marriage not out of love, but as part of a calculated plan. She described a heartbreak from her past, how a man she had loved deeply had betrayed her, leaving her humiliated and broken. "I swore that I would never be vulnerable again. I built my life on strength and control, and you were an experiment. A way for me to reclaim my power, to rewrite the story on my terms." David's hands shook as he read the final line. "I'm sorry for the pain this will cause you, but it's better this way. By the time you finish this letter, you'll understand that we were never meant to last." He dropped the letter, his chest tightening as he reached for the legal documents. His eyes widened as he realized what they were: papers transferring Margaret's wealth to a charitable foundation, effective immediately. She had given away everything. David staggered back, his mind reeling. The realization hit him like a tidal wave. Margaret hadn't just used him. She had set him up to fall. He was nothing more than a pawn in her twisted game, a way for her to exorcise the ghosts of her past. Anger and humiliation burned in his chest as he tried to make sense of it all. Why would she do this? What kind of person could be so cruel, so calculated? Before he could gather his thoughts, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway jolted him back to reality. Margaret was home. He quickly replaced the documents and locked the door behind him, his heart racing as he retreated to his room. That night, as he lay awake in the darkness, one thought consumed him. Who is Margaret, really? And what else is she hiding? The tension in the house grew unbearable after that night. David couldn't shake the weight of what he had uncovered in Margaret's study. The letter, her confession, the legal documents, they played over and over in his mind like a haunting melody he couldn't escape. But as shocking as her revelations were, they raised more questions than answers. Why would she orchestrate such a cruel plan, only to give away her wealth? And what did she mean when she said they were never meant to last? Margaret, on the other hand, carried on as though nothing had changed. Her demeanor remained cool and composed, her routine unbroken. She was a fortress of calm, impenetrable and unshakable. But David could see through the cracks. He noticed the way her hands trembled slightly when she poured her morning tea. He saw the way her eyes darted toward the study door when she thought he wasn't looking. She was hiding something, something deeper than what he had already discovered. And he was determined to find out what it was. On the 8th day of their marriage, David decided to confront her. They were seated across from each other at the dining table, the silence between them stretching like an invisible wall. Margaret was halfway through her meal when David cleared his throat, the sound sharp and sudden in the quiet room. "We need to talk," he said, his voice steady but firm. Margaret looked up, her expression unreadable. "About what?" "About you," he replied. "And about us." She set down her fork and leaned back in her chair, folding her hands in her lap. "Go on." David hesitated, searching for the right words. "Why did you marry me, Margaret?" "Really?" "I know it wasn't out of love." Her lips curved into a faint smile, but there was no warmth in it. "I thought we were past that," she said. "You knew this wasn't a fairy tale, David." "I made that clear from the beginning." "I did," he admitted. "But I didn't know it was a game to you. I didn't know you were using me to prove something to yourself." Margaret's smile faded, her eyes narrowing slightly. "So, you've been snooping," she said, her tone cold. "I found the letter," he said, meeting her gaze. "And the documents. You gave everything away, didn't you? The money, the assets. It's all gone." For the first time, Margaret's composure faltered. Her eyes flickered with something David couldn't quite place. Anger, maybe, or regret. "What I do with my money is none of your concern," she said sharply. "It is when you've dragged me into this," he shot back. "You said this was a business arrangement, but it's more than that, isn't it? You're running from something or someone. And I want to know what it is." Margaret's jaw tightened, and for a moment, David thought she might lash out. But instead, she stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "This conversation is over," she said, her voice icy. "You're free to leave if you're so unhappy. But I suggest you think carefully about where you'll go. Without me, you're back where you started, poor and desperate." She turned and walked away, her footsteps echoing down the hall. David sat at the table long after she was gone, his mind racing. Her reaction had only confirmed what he already knew. Margaret was hiding something, and it wasn't just about money. That night, unable to sleep, he found himself wandering the house again. This time, he wasn't looking for answers. He was looking for clues. He started with the library, then moved to the guest rooms, checking every drawer and cabinet for anything that might reveal the truth. It wasn't until he reached the attic that he found it. The attic was a dusty, dimly lit space filled with old furniture and forgotten relics. Boxes were stacked haphazardly in the corners, their labels faded with age. David opened one at random, his hands brushing against yellowed papers and brittle photographs. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a collection of family mementos. But then, he found the journal. It was tucked beneath a pile of old letters, its leather cover cracked and worn. David opened it cautiously, the pages brittle under his fingers. The handwriting was unmistakably Margaret's, though it was looser, more hurried than the elegant script he was used to. The entries were dated decades earlier, and as David began to read, a chill ran down his spine. May 3rd, 1978. "He betrayed me. After everything I gave him, my love, my trust, my loyalty, he threw it all away for someone younger, someone prettier. I'll never forgive him for what he's done. But I won't let him win. I'll find a way to make him pay." David's eyes widened as he read on, the story unfolding in painful detail. Margaret had been in love once, deeply and passionately. But her partner, whom she referred to only as H, had betrayed her, leaving her heartbroken and humiliated. June 12, 1980. "H is married now, living the life he stole from me. But I'll show him. I'll show them all. They think I'm weak, but they'll see what I'm capable of." The entries grew darker as the years went on, filled with anger and bitterness. Margaret had dedicated her life to building her fortune, using it as a shield against the pain of her past. And now, decades later, she was still haunted by the ghosts of her old wounds. David closed the journal, his hands trembling. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place. Margaret's marriage to him wasn't just about control. It was a way for her to rewrite history, to reclaim the power she felt she had lost all those years ago. But what scared him most wasn't her anger or her manipulation. It was the realization that she hadn't moved on. Margaret was still living in the shadow of her past, trapped in a cycle of pain and revenge that seemed to have no end. The next morning, Margaret's mood was unusually bright, as if the confrontation the night before had never happened. She greeted David with a smile, her voice light and cheerful. But David couldn't look at her the same way. He couldn't shake the image of the journal, the raw pain and bitterness etched into every word. And he couldn't help but wonder, what else is she capable of? The days that followed David's discovery in the attic were a blur of tension and confusion. Margaret acted as if everything was normal, as if the journal, her confessions, and the truth of her past were just figments of his imagination. Her behavior was erratic. One moment, she was charming and gentle, the next, cold and distant, as if she were a stranger. Margaret's gaze lingered on him for a moment longer before she turned away, her figure disappearing into the shadows of the garden. "Don't say I didn't warn you," she called over her shoulder. David was left standing there, his mind racing, the weight of the unknown pressing down on him. He knew that whatever lay ahead, it would change everything. And perhaps, just perhaps, it would be the last step in unraveling the truth. David spent the next day in a state of confusion, his thoughts a jumbled mess of emotions and questions. The key Margaret had given him felt like a heavy burden in his pocket, each step toward the bank making him feel more trapped in a labyrinth of lies. As much as he wanted to know the truth, there was a lingering fear gnawing at him. What if the truth was worse than he could ever imagine? What if, after everything, he would wish he hadn't opened the envelope at all? When he reached the bank, the air was thick with tension. The marble floors and sterile lights did little to ease his nerves. He followed the receptionist to the safe deposit boxes, his heartbeat echoing in his chest. She unlocked the box with a brass key and handed him a thick envelope without another word. He left the bank as quickly as he could, as though he were running away from the consequences of what he was about to learn. Once inside his room, David opened the envelope, his hands trembling. The first document was a letter from Margaret, written in her elegant, familiar handwriting. As he read her words, his stomach churned. "David, if you are reading this, it means you have uncovered the truth. I've kept it from you for so long, but you deserve to know. I never wanted to hurt you, but I had to make a choice that no mother should ever have to make." David's head spun. What did she mean? He read on, his heart racing. "The man who abandoned me all those years ago, the one you thought was your father, is not the man who raised you. I had to give you away when you were just a baby. I couldn't raise you in the environment I was in. You were my son, but I wasn't strong enough to care for you, not the way you deserved. So, I made the hardest decision of my life. I gave you up." David froze. She gave me up? The words seemed to hang in the air, unspoken, in the place where his past should have been. He felt as though the ground beneath him had vanished. The family he thought he knew, the mother he had always known, none of it was what it seemed. "I placed you with a family, one that could provide for you, give you a life I could never offer. And I watched from afar, David. I kept track of you. I wanted to tell you, but I couldn't bear to see you as someone else's child. So I stayed away. You had a family, siblings, a mother, and I never wanted to interfere with that life, even if it hurt me to see you from the shadows." David's heart ached. He had never suspected such a truth. His entire life had been built on a lie. The woman who had raised him, the woman he called Mom, was not his biological mother. He had never known Margaret as a child, never seen her face when he was learning to walk or talk. The letter continued. "David, I know this is hard to understand. I know you might hate me for what I did. I wanted you to have a better life, but I also wanted you to have a family. So I stayed silent, hoping you would never find out. But now, I am asking for your forgiveness." David's eyes blurred with tears, but he couldn't look away from the letter. His hands shook as he read the rest of Margaret's confession. "When I married you, I did it not just because I was afraid of losing you, but because I was trying to make up for my past mistakes. I know now that it was wrong. You deserve to know the truth long before now. But I wanted you close, David. I didn't want to lose you again. David felt a strange sensation wash over him, anger, confusion, and something deeper, more painful. He had never wanted to question his own identity, but the truth was undeniable. Margaret had kept him from knowing who he really was. And now, she was asking for his forgiveness. He read the final letter, which explained the last part of her strange behavior. The money, David, everything I have, the house, the assets, they were never meant for you. When I married you, I did it to give you a life free of the secrets I had kept. I thought if I made you rich, if I gave you everything you could ever need, it would make up for the years I spent away from you. But now I realize it's not enough. I'm donating everything I have to charity. I don't want my wealth to define you. You are not your inheritance. You are not the things I could give you. You are so much more than that. I want you to make your own choices, to live a life free of the weight of my mistakes. David's mind reeled. He had been married to the woman who had given him up as a baby, the woman who had secretly watched over him for years. But what was more shocking was the fact that Margaret was giving up everything she had, choosing to donate her wealth to charity. Was it guilt? Was it redemption? Or was it just the final attempt of a woman who knew her time was running out? David had questions. So many questions. But the biggest question of all loomed over him. What now? The door to his room opened slowly, and there stood Margaret, her face pale and drawn. Her eyes were filled with sadness and regret. David looked up at her, feeling the weight of her confession heavy in the air between them. David, she whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't know how to explain everything. But you deserve to know. You deserve to have a life that's your own, without my lies. David stood still, the pieces of his shattered past beginning to click into place. He had been manipulated, controlled, yet somehow he understood. Margaret had done what she thought was best for him, even if it had been cruel and misguided. She had given him up to protect him, to give him a life that was better than the one she could offer. But it didn't change the fact that he couldn't live with the woman who had kept him in the dark. I'm sorry, David said quietly, his voice hoarse with emotion. But I can't go back to being your son. Margaret's face crumpled, tears falling freely. She nodded, understanding that her actions had pushed him too far. I understand, she whispered. I'll always love you, David. I just wanted you to be happy. David turned away, stepping out of the room. The truth had come to light, and it had broken him. But he was free now. Free to live his life on his own terms, to make his own choices, to rebuild his identity from the ground up. The door closed softly behind him, and David walked into the world, ready to embrace whatever came next, without the shadow of Margaret's lies hanging over him.